On Tuesday, the House Intelligence Committee held one of the few open hearings that it regularly hosts, the annual Worldwide Threat Assessment. Needless to say, many lawmakers were salivating over the prospect of the war between Russia and Ukraine going global.
We've always had this discussion about what we should do, prefaced on the notion, well, they're not part of NATO, therefore. In the final analysis, Ukraine, what they represent, and what they have done so far represents the highest ideals, personification of what we wanted NATO to be.
I believe that the American people think we need to do more. He clearly wants to recreate the Soviet Union and pick up all the Balkan states.
Okay, first of all, he wants to recreate the Tsarist Empire, if anything. Watch his damn speech again. Secondly, it was Yugoslavia, not the Soviet Union, that was the communist stronghold in the Balkans, and they weren't even allies much of the time. Not a lot of intelligence on the Intelligence Committee. But at least Congresswoman Speer wasn't justifying risking a nuclear conflict by saying it would prevent a nuclear conflict.
We've had many non-NATO interventions in the past: Kosovo, Bosnia, Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, Cameroon, Yemen, Korea, Syria, Kuwait, just to name a few. But the one difference is the nuclear capability. So what we're getting asked a lot is, are we basically creating an incentive for a nuclear proliferation? Because the message that we're sending is, if you have nuclear weapons and you're crazy, we're going to stand back.
Yeah, you're damn right we're going to stand back. You think nuclear proliferation is bad, but nuclear war is good? Perhaps what was most interesting was what wasn't said. Zero members of the panel voiced any concern about the administration's lack of interest in diplomacy and its decision to arm Ukrainian forces that include far-right extremists. It was an important topic that was completely ignored, though we were reminded of some unintended consequences of arming reactionaries to fight Russians in the past.
The president issued an executive order to declassify the 9/11 materials, and we're a little late in receiving them here on the Hill. So I'd like the commitment from all of you to provide unredacted versions of all the 9/11 investigative materials to the committee as quickly as possible, at least all those covered by the president's executive order. And I'm hoping you can each give me an affirmative commitment to do that. Director Wray?
We can certainly commit to work with you to provide as much information as we possibly can. And I know our staff.
Well, the president issued an executive order, sir, so I appreciate the effort to work with us.
We will absolutely comply with the executive order.
That would be fantastic.
We will comply with the executive order.
Thank you.
Yes, same.
Yes.
Yes.
20 years later, and we still don't have the full story of what happened after the last time we did the Oprah thing with reactionaries looking for weapons to fight the Russians. Virtually no members of Congress are even talking about the risks here, with the exception of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who tweeted this week that there are consequences to flooding Ukraine with billions of dollars in U.S. weapons, and they are unpredictable and likely disastrous, especially when they are given to paramilitary groups without accountability, Omar said. Another topic that briefly came up: how Russia's invasion has impacted Putin's popularity at home and the wave of anti-war demonstrations to hit the streets of cities throughout Russia. Unfortunately, there was no interrogation of how this movement might be impacted by the sweeping sanctions that have devastated the Russian economy and millions of innocent lives. Just unrestrained glee. There was Representative man-boy Eric Swalwell gushing over this pain, just a few days removed from his call to expel every Russian student from U.S. colleges and universities.
Essentially, if you're a Russian, you are blocked from traveling. You can't use your Apple Pay. You can't stream your favorite video game. You cannot watch the latest Batman movie. You can't export your gas. You're isolated from the world.
Actually, numerous countries do oppose sanctions, countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, but that's not the point. Even without China and India joining in, these sanctions are hurting ordinary Russians who might now be more inclined to adopt an ultra-nationalist view of us against the world. The Russian invasion will empower Nazis, no doubt, and the U.S. reaction will allow them to flourish. Meanwhile, across Capitol Hill in the Senate, U.S. Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland testified on the situation in Ukraine, and she knows it pretty well. She was the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs in 2014 during the uprising and overthrow of the Yanukovych government. Audio of Nuland on a phone call with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine at the time, Jeffrey Priat, shows she was extremely involved in Kyiv's affairs during the unrest. The call was likely recorded and leaked by Russian intelligence. Here's Democracy Now!'s reporting on it back in 2014.
Nuland expresses frustration over Europe's response to the political crisis in Ukraine using frank terms.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, the EU.
While Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland's comment about the EU dominated the news headlines because she used a curse, there were several other very interesting parts of her conversation with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine.
Let me work on Klitschko, and if you can just keep, I think we want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing. And then the other issue is some kind of outreach to Yanukovych, but we probably regroup on that tomorrow as we see how things start to fall into place.
So on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote the note, Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deeds to stick. So Biden's willing.
Later in the call, Nuland tells Ambassador Priat, I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience and the governing experience. Well, the State Department got what they wanted. Yats, or Arseniy Yatsenyuk, went on to become the post-coup prime minister. Now, of course, none of this justifies Russia's illegal invasion, but U.S. fingerprints were all over the change in government in Kyiv 8 years ago that created the situation for this conflict to arise. Anyway, I bring up this hearing because I wanted to highlight Marco Rubio's time for questioning, just a chef's kiss of content. It begins with him being big mad about Juan Guaido getting dissed. Talked about this on yesterday's show. U.S. diplomats met with Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro to discuss easing sanctions in exchange for direct shipments of oil to the U.S. Apparently, talks went well, better than talks with the Saudis, who reportedly won't even take a meeting with the Biden administration to discuss boosting oil supplies. Pretty astonishing snub. But back to little Marco, who was pretty upset that the State Department might not be as into Juan Guaido anymore.
Does the United States recognize Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela?
We recognize his leadership in Venezuela, yes.
Do we recognize him as the president of Venezuela? Is that not our official position?
It is.
So why would we meet with a dictator, Nicolas Maduro, without telling Juan Guaido or the ambassador here in the United States that it was happening? I just don't understand why we think that cutting a deal with Maduro now to lift sanctions, as he yesterday bragged on television about that meeting and how it's the end of, and as they mocked Guaido, that meeting did tremendous damage to the person that we recognize as the president of Venezuela. It's incredibly troubling, and it would mean nothing.
So mad. He's so mad. Guaido is Rubio's boy. Now he's left hanging. Rubio then ends his questioning, getting Nuland to reveal a pretty big whoopsie that neither of them likely wanted to discuss. Earlier, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs reported that it had found evidence of a biological weapons program sponsored by the U.S. operating in Ukraine. This was widely considered propaganda, one aimed particularly at the U.S., which justified its invasion of Iraq based on claims of weapons of mass destruction. Well, now cue Rubio, who clearly wanted Nuland to knock down these claims.
Does Ukraine have chemical or biological weapons?
Ukraine has biological research facilities.
Okay, that's not a no. I can assure you, if Ukraine didn't have biological weapons, Nuland would have said so. She would have absolutely said, no, they don't. But instead, we basically got confirmation that they do. Nuland continued,
Which, in fact, we are now quite concerned Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of. So we are working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those research materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces should they approach.
I know that since the invasion started, there are more important questions in Ukraine, like how to prevent hundreds of civilians from getting shelled by the Russian military. But what the fuck was the US thinking helping Ukraine set up a biological weapons program next to a nuclear-armed superpower that was just looking for an excuse to invade? I mean, why go through this trouble unless there's an actual plan at some point to use them? Just when you think this couldn't get worse, based on actions of Vladimir Putin alone, you've got the US State Department saying, wait a second, hold my beer. What a disaster. Finally, the situation involving WNBA star Brittany Griner is now pretty worrisome. She's been in custody for nearly 2 weeks in Moscow after she was alleged to have been caught by airport security with vape cartridges containing hash oil. The Russians are not at all chill about weed, and the timing of her arrest is bad given the hot war in Ukraine and the ensuing economic war with the United States. There's been very little public information about Griner's whereabouts since February, beyond officials in Moscow saying she was detained last month and remains in custody, and that a criminal case has been opened against an American basketball player for, quote, large-scale transportation of drugs. It's a crime that comes with a 10-year sentence. According to members of the Congressional Black Caucus who met with President Biden this week, the White House is aware of the situation and is working on her release. Griner has played basketball for years in Russia. Lots of WNBA players are forced to travel and play year-round because they simply don't make enough wages playing in the United States. And that is also messed up. Hey, thanks for watching. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of our new videos. Also, if you want to see Means Morning News in its complete form, not just the clips we post here, head on over to Means TV and get access to all our new episodes and our entire backlog, plus tons of other great movies and original TV shows.